Going to war has historically been extremely expensive, something that Vladimir Putin would have known when he pushed his men across the border and into Ukraine. The question is whether it's as good or as bad as he thought. So how has the cost of the war affected Russia, and what can the country expect as a result of their decision to attack Ukraine? I think it's also important to note that you can win a war on the battlefield but leave your economy so wrecked and your country so isolated that you never recover, and you are such a pariah that the world leaves you to slowly die in obscurity. Let's also not forget, if Russia should win the war on the battlefield and be left with a broken Ukraine in their sphere of influence, how will they rebuild that country? Because there will be no support from the West, and the costs of just that will dwarf any damage attributed to the Russian economy. This should serve as additional motivation for the Ukrainian people. Lose this war and your country will remain a lunar landscape forever, because Russia will not rebuild you. Your country will remain a dead zone buffered between it and the rest of the world. Let's continue. We must consider the two factors currently in play: the direct cost of the war thus far and the future expected cost to the economy. In terms of the direct costs, Forbes has estimated that Russia has spent approximately $82 billion in the first 9 months since the start of its war against Ukraine. Although other estimates have this cost as high as $1 billion per day. Moscow has allocated nearly $29 billion to support for its army, spent close to $16 billion on soldiers' salaries, and expended more than $9 billion to pay off the families of servicemen killed in combat. Another $7.7 billion has gone to support the families of those wounded in the war, while the Russian army's massive losses of military equipment on Ukrainian soil have cost the state almost $21 billion more. With an expected second mobilization on its way and resultant additional losses, you can expect these costs to skyrocket. Despite these excessive costs, their economy is doing better than expected. We have all been waiting for the predicted collapse that never came, and the forecasted 8 to 10% fall in GDP for the year has been reduced to a 3 to 4% drop. Still, before the war, 3% growth was predicted. Recovery is only expected to begin in 2024 at best, and only in the unlikely event that external factors do not significantly worsen. You should consider the second mobilization a significant external factor. Russia looks set to see another decade of stagnation followed by a decade of regression. The government and the central bank have softened the economic blow from the war and the sanctions that followed it, not least through the conservative fiscal policies of recent years, such as consistently balancing the budget with an oil price of $45 per barrel and being extremely strict with government expenditure even at the cost of economic growth. In addition, they have prepared for the sanctions. State companies and major banks carried out stress tests, including scenarios in which the country was disconnected from SWIFT, the West stopped supplying certain technologies, and correspondent accounts were blocked, though other measures, such as the freezing of gold and currency reserves, were not modeled and could be used by the West if necessary. Due to a traditional reluctance to report problems, the Russian authorities were all optimistic, with the most serious sanction expected being an IT and microchip embargo that resulted in the awkward situation of its civil aviation flagship carrier, Aeroflot, having to strip its aircraft for parts. Thus far the Russians have managed to continue to produce their weapons without problem, although potential delays in this would not be advertised. Thanks to these preparations, the effect of sanctions proved weaker than predicted, but it has also been more prolonged. The budget, which stayed positive in the first few months by oil and gas revenues, has begun to shrink. For example, to diversify its exports it started selling more oil to India, but with a $30 per barrel discount, this volume has subsequently also started to decline. Then China was meant to come to their aid, but only increased their oil buy from 72 million barrels to 80 million. As a result, there was a 12% decrease in oil sales in 1 month alone. Non-oil and gas revenues fell by 20% in October in annual terms, and almost all the growth in oil and gas revenues came from the increase in the mineral extraction tax on Gazprom, something that is not sustainable in the long term. The fall in industrial production in the first 10 months of this year turned out to be relatively small at 0.1%. This, however, is largely down to increased military expenditure, which provided growth in sectors such as clothing and metal goods, which includes tanks and missiles, masking a fall in civilian sectors, such as the halving of automobile production. Then of course there is the cost of the diaspora since the start of the war and is estimated at between 500,000 and 1 million people. This became critical after the mobilization, with queues of people stretching for miles at the border with Georgia. A shortage of qualified personnel resulting from the loss of civilians will put pressure on the labor market, driving up wages faster than productivity and leading to inflationary risks. Just ask the British government post-Brexit. Their labor shortage has resulted in real production problems, a lack of service support and an inflation increase due to skyrocketing wages. The recession is likely to continue because all Russian industry is highly dependent on the import of high-tech goods from the West. Technology imports from nearly all countries have fallen. A collapse in those imports will reduce production and make it more primitive, a process that is already underway. Import substitution is resulting in worn-out high-tech components being replaced with less advanced options and the resulting drop-off in performance. The departure of Western companies and the total end to energy exports to Europe will continue to hold the Russian economy back. It can also count on little in the way of support from within. With such a dire atmosphere, investment is at risk of being slashed. Private business was already limiting investment due to the unfavorable business climate. Now the war and sanctions have ended it completely. Understandably, with the risk of being forced to indirectly contribute to the war effort through taxes, most pro-state business will not invest. Large-scale investment on the part of the state is also becoming a problem. The 3-year budget that has been passed has the war as the clear priorities. The budget's main areas of expenditure are the security sectors, which will account for almost a third of all expenditure in 2023. Expenditure on the economy, on the contrary, is being reduced from 4.5 trillion rubles in 2022 to 3.5 trillion in 2023. A record quarter of all expenditure is classified, which hints that it may very well end in up the war column, let's say as a payment to Wagner, for example. The total volume of expenditure will effectively remain unchanged with inflationary pressures making this a real terms reduction. Expenditure on military needs, however, is protected from any fall in income, so it is expenditure on the development of the economy and the expansion of social programs that will be slashed if cuts are needed. Trust me, they will be slashed. The government simply can't afford to have the investment climate as one of its priorities. It is focused on the needs of the army. 300,000 people aged 22 to 50 have already been mobilized, lowering GDP by 0.5%, and there will be a second mobilization shortly that is expected to include even more men. The cost of arming them and preparing them for war is going to be exorbitant. Major difficulties arise from the reorientation of Russian production toward new markets. The throughput capability of infrastructure linking Russia with the East is limited, port, rail, and pipeline capacities are already overloaded, and the creation of new capacity requires resources and technology. International container shipping companies to refuse working with Russia, which is disrupting supplies of non-sanctioned goods, even to friendly states. Problems are not only with delivering the goods, but also in paying or receiving payment for them. Transactions in euros and dollars can be blocked or take a long time. Even in friendly countries, banks refuse to open accounts for Russian companies and correspondent accounts for Russian banks. Russia is also often required to make compromises and offer discounts on its goods to those who are still prepared to buy them because at the end of the day Russia needs them more than they need Russia. Turning back to the domestic market can only provide partial support to manufacturing. It's simply too small to sustain the appetite of the whole country. The state has not been able to aid business with systemic solutions, only undertaking targeted measures, such as allowing payments in cash for foreign trade operations to avoid the use of dollars and euros. Russian firms are mostly finding their own ways to adapt to the new conditions. The war against Ukraine has lowered the Russian economy's modest pre-war potential from 2 to 3% to about 1%. The economy's development is now in reverse and will take 3 to 5 years for that decline to come to a halt, once again end-of-war dependent. President Vladimir Putin likes to repeat that Russia already has everything it needs for development and growth. But a transition to growth based on internal resources would require an end to the war in Ukraine. Something that is unlikely to happen, given their determination to exterminate the Ukrainian state. There is a requirement for more competition which was previously provided by Western countries, a need for economic property rights and for economic infringements to be decriminalized. The president and the government have consistently failed to provide these types of reforms to drive the country forward. In conclusion, it would appear obvious that if this war was to continue, the Russian economy would be set back for decades. The state apparatus would crumble as much-needed infrastructure repairs and expansion is put on the back burner in favor of the war and achieving its outcomes. Now admittedly we expected this to happen sooner, but somehow, they managed to tourniquet the bleeding and keep their economy sustainable, at least in the short term. But as I have already said, there's more than one way to lose this war, so for Russia, losing is a guarantee, and I think that NATO knows it.